session that I'm really excited about, but I feel like I need to address the elephant in the room kind of up front. For those of you who saw my opening remarks this morning, you may be wondering, hey Ryan, why do you look different? And there's a couple reasons. One, I mentioned this morning that this whole event is designed to be collaborative and share information and solve problems. So I am literally and figuratively rolling up my sleeves because it's not going to work. But also, like any good Oscars host, I have to have wardrobe changes throughout the show, right? And then lastly, not to confuse anybody, but there's another Ryan on stage, and he happens to be wearing a pink shirt just like I am, so I was hoping to actually have some differentiation.
You could have coordinated a little bit better, couldn't we?
So, as I mentioned, I'm really excited about this session. This session is going to cover a topic that we've been working for probably better than 12 months at this point, trying to bring to fruition. We touched on it last year at Collaborate, and really what we're looking to talk about and kind of articulate to the community is, you've probably heard a number of people throughout the show, and you'll probably hear them over the next couple days, where it doesn't make sense to do duplicative assessments. Why am I having to do arguably the same things for each one of my customers, but also in other industry stakeholders? And that's what we sought out to solve about 12 months ago was, hey, there's some synergies out there in the market with HITRUST and other organizations. How do we start to partner better? And we were able to start to partner with StateRAMP, and that's what we want to talk about today. We're going to kind of set some context for where we're at today and kind of where we're going. But before we do that, I want to have the rest of the panel introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. My name is Ryan Winkler. I'm a practice director at 360 Advanced. We perform cybersecurity and assessment services, and I've been working on the HITRUST team with 360 Advanced since 2016. I've been there for 8 years. I'm the HITRUST practice lead, so really spent the last few years really helping build up our HITRUST program and being able to better support our clients. In my previous life, I worked for a major payer doing information security, and got to get my feet wet in the world of compliance and HIPAA, and kind of just branched out from there and wanted to get into external assessing so I could help more organizations instead of just one.
Good morning. I'm Noah Brown. I'm the PMO director for StateRAMP. Background, I come from originally the DoD. I'm just happy to be here, happy to talk about what we're doing with HITRUST, and I'll just leave my intro with that.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for being here. Greg Carpenter, Senior Security Partner Strategist with AWS on the GSEA program, Global Security Compliance and Acceleration Program. Yeah, so we help customers as they're starting to look through their compliance journey, and we provide what we call informal advisory services. We provide AWS resources, and then we also roll that into vetted partner solutions.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting panel because Ryan not only is the practice lead for the HITRUST services that 360 Advanced offers, but 360 Advanced is actually a 3PAO for StateRAMP. So they're able to do assessments against StateRAMP and then ultimately work with their clients through their authorization process. Noah's being a little bit humble. Noah also is dual-hatted, not only the PMO director, but he's also the CISO for StateRAMP. So him and his team are the ones establishing the baselines and dictating policy for what it takes to get through StateRAMP. And then Greg and I have a long history. We've known each other for the better part of a decade. Greg has great insights from his time currently with AWS, but he also has worked with the Center for Internet Security, and he also had worked for the state of New York supporting the Army National Guard. So he has a lot of different perspectives on what the state and local government community is faced with, which I think is pretty relevant to the conversation we have today. So Greg, I'm going to start with you. There's lots of regulatory, legal, private frameworks, questionnaires out there in the world, if you will. What are we seeing that's creating challenges for organizations trying to make sense of everything that's getting thrown at them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when you start to look at the SLG, the state and local government community specifically, with reference to security and compliance, it boils down to, every state has a tried and true cybersecurity, policy with different regs regulations, right, that they're trying to meet. What they tend to roll into those regulations is where you'll start to see some of the challenges, right? So if you have an agency that's maybe managing or controlling, PHI, your healthcare information, what do they have to meet at that point in time? HIPAA, right? Your health information privacy. I don't know the acronym anymore, but your HIPAA law. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms. But essentially, then what if one of your agencies is managing some credit card transactions? What do they have to meet? They now have to meet PCI DSS, right? So now you're challenging your entire organization, not only with a true cybersecurity policy, following security and compliance, but now you're also throwing multiple compliance regulations on top of that, right? If you actually look at, I think, from my CIS background, there's 3 or 4 states that actually recommend and reference the CIS controls, their top level security controls as part of their compliance background. So now you have another compliance framework on it. And then I like to look at it as 3 different challenge lenses, right? So your first lens is the agency itself. When you talk about cloud computing specifically, an agency has to look at, as I start to migrate to the cloud or consider the cloud, the shared responsibility, right? There was a session earlier. They did a great job talking about shared responsibility. So I won't necessarily go into that, but that's their challenge, how mature they are and how they look at inheriting specific security and compliance controls. But more importantly, the discussion is not what they inherit, it's what they don't inherit. What is their responsibility? So that's what they have to focus on. So that's the first challenge that you see with an agency. And I think something we're going to talk about when we start to reference StateRAMP is you got to look at the vendors now that these agencies are trying to procure and utilize to also augment their security and compliance requirements, right? So now I have a vendor that I need to come in. How do I know that they're secure? How do I know, what are they meeting that I can check a box with, right? That's when we look at, you'll often have conversations around StateRAMP or FedRAMP, and then that adds to the confusion.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. I talk to the market each and every day. You're basically describing the perfect storm or the nightmare of continuous audit fatigue, and trying to make sense of it all. So it begs the question, and this is really for all 3 of you. Why are there all these disparate standards, regulations, frameworks? And feel free to get philosophical.
So I think from the state ramp side and what we've seen with state government, it's square peg round hole. Trying to find a way to take a regulatory framework or a control set and make it work for what you need done. NIST is a prime example. That's kind of the whole reason why StateRAMP came about, was how do we assess against NIST without doing business or having a contract with a federal agency? So that ability to assess against NIST, become NIST compliant, or have someone attest to your NIST status is where StateRAMP started. In my opinion, I think a big part of it is just there's been so much scope bleed of, if you're in the financial side, you need this assessment. If you are in PII, PHI, list goes on and on, CGIS, there's always some new framework or some new audit that needs to be completed. So in my opinion, I think it's just scope creep across the board. And it's really not enough people coming together with a common understanding of, we need to simplify this, we need to make this one standardized process or as close to it as we can to alleviate some of the burden on the provider community.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I actually think too, it's really been a lack of communication across industries too. That's led to multiple different types of standards and frameworks. And understandably, knowing that there are certain industries that have certain requirements than others, PCI versus other types of standards like ISO 27001. But I think that there's kind of been a lack of industry accountability for different frameworks and standards too.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add last, I agree with both of you wholeheartedly. I think there's 4, maybe 5 frameworks that we could lean on, and everything else is built off of that if you start to really drill down. And that's where you'll start to see controls mapped across the board, right? And if you can map controls across the board, why can you do that? Because they're the same.
So that actually leads into my next question. Like, is there a dramatic difference between all of these different frameworks or standards, even regulations, and not only here in the US, but kind of globally?
I can start that one. At the end of the day, I mean, we can easily do a Venn diagram and show the pros and the cons and the similarities across them. But you know, at the end of the day, think about what happens if you're not compliant with a regulation or a compliance standard or framework. It still leads to some level of downfall, right? There's a customer who's not happy with you and now leaves you because you're not compliant, or now you're getting fined by regulatory agencies. You know, I think really at the end of the day, you know, in the grand scheme of things, there's not a huge difference except for you know, different bodies coming at you when you're not being compliant.
I'd love to say that the StateRAMP NIST baseline is the gold standard. However, I think a big part of it is, I don't think there's a lot of differences between the assessments. I'm sure that those differences are highlighted, especially if you're looking at different audits and you have an assessor who wants to quote you those separate audits. But I think a big part of it is the controls are really generally on the same track, the same requirements, the same outcome. I think a big part of it is the assessor who you have, what they're assessing, how well they're assessing it, and really looking at control sets or frameworks that have a defined standard versus most NIST controls that organizationally defined. If I can define it myself, I can make it as easy as I'd like. So I think a big part of it is the assessor and the overarching organization who's setting those requirements for the service provider is key. As far as the actual control requirements themselves, they're pretty similar. It's a matter of who's checking them and how they're being governed.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think, you know, what we've shared with similarities, it makes sense. There's not a lot of differences. And to your point, I love that point, right? It's like, make sure that when you're picking an assessor, they know the environment that they're assessing. We see that with cloud specifically, right? With AWS, it's like, and that's why, you know, I say our partners are vetted, but they're vetted to not only know the framework, they're also vetted to know AWS and the services. So that's a very important.
So if I'm reading between the lines here, it's less about the validity of the control sets between these different frameworks. It's more about the process on top of the control sets, and really it boils down to trust, right? It's a trust in understanding that a rigorous, predefined, standards-based process was followed, which has produced a more favorable, not more favorable, but a higher trustworthy outcome, that what you're reading as a result of that testing actually is working and in place. Okay, I learned something, that's good. So no, so we haven't really talked about StateRAMP specifically. Maybe we can touch on that really quickly, what the mission of StateRAMP is, and then ultimately, you know, understanding that this is more about the process as opposed to the framework itself. You know, is that the impetus of what StateRAMP is trying to do?
Sure. So prior to StateRAMP, there's various NIST or other assessments required by state government. StateRAMP was really founded on the idea of what if we actually developed a common process, a common audit for state and local government for the service providers they do business with. And it moved away from days of past where if I'm a service provider and you give me a spreadsheet with 325 controls, I'll tell you I'm compliant on everything. Moving to an assess process, actually verifying that these things are done. The whole trust but verify idea was still behind on the state and local side. So having someone come in with StateRAMP, setting required standards, required implementations of controls, really was the foundation of where StateRAMP came from, was how can we partner with state and local government, how can we work with the service provider community, the assessor side, and develop a process that states can trust and service providers can then leverage and reuse, the do once, use many model. And you know, so many providers today, multiple assessments, multiple audits. StateRAMP was really kind of the person who said, how do we talk amongst ourselves and figure this out? It's shocking when you get people together and you say, why are we doing things this way? The crazy ideas that come out of that discussion. So StateRAMP was really founded on the idea that we're here to alleviate the stressors and some of the work related to security assessments and help states and advise states on what they should be requiring, and then work with the service provider community and the assessor side to implement a process by which they can move forward. I've been lucky enough to be part of the program since its inception, and it's really just amazing to see how many service providers, the 3POs, the states, their ability to see what we're doing and really dive into it because they're just excited for this amazing idea. It's not really a new one, but just bringing the right people together and having that conversation really what drove this thing forward.
Yeah, and just for folks who may not be super familiar in the room, StateRAMP is ultimately within the StateRAMP community a step in the procurement process. So if you're a cloud service provider that wants to sell into states or state agencies, there are a number of states, which I'm about to ask Noah, hint, like what it consists of. They are asking you to go through the StateRAMP authorization process to get your authorization in order to purchase your product or your service, whatever it may be. So I think there's been a lot of growth in the last year for StateRAMP. Care to share any light on where you were and where you are and kind of where you're going?
Sure. So we're actually starting to see states implement procurement language specific to StateRAMP requirements. That's huge because you can ask someone to do something all day long, but until you tie money to it, it can be kind of difficult to move those things forward. So we're seeing multiple states are either have implemented procurement language related to StateRAMP, or they are, requiring or working with our team to develop that language. It's really kind of the birthplace of the snapshot program for StateRAMP. Almost, it's a gap assessment light is how I describe it. But the ability to have a score for providers who are looking to bid on a contract. Following that, next was the progressing snapshot. So if you get a score and you have findings, you have issues that you need to work through, how do you improve those things? So multiple states requiring StateRAMP, more that I can't really go into, but in discussions with that are looking to leverage StateRAMP. But it's really, I think over the coming months, you'll see more and more states developing this language, and we're working with them to figure out ways to help service providers, not to be this burden of a requirement, but to allow service providers a way in, not having to dive straight into the pool, but wade in slowly and help providers work through the process and become ultimately StateRAMP authorized is our goal for everyone.
Yeah, so we're kind of alluding to this whole idea of reciprocity, right? So how do we leverage the work that's been done and recognize its value kind of moving on? Greg, do you have any examples of other reciprocity initiatives where folks are trying to help vendors, providers, whomever, kind of ease the pain?
I mean, if we talk about StateRAMP, in that vein, if you look at Texas ramp, we're here, Texas, right? So if you talk about Texas ramp, right, they have true reciprocity to not only StateRAMP, but they also recognize FedRAMP. I know StateRAMP has the FedRAMP gap attestation, I believe. I prefer you to talk about that. I think you know more about that than I do. But essentially, I mean, that's what we're looking for from reciprocity. We often see in the cloud space, FedRAMP is the high bar. So when we talk about, even though we meet all these other compliance frameworks, I think we're over 96 different laws, regulations, privacy, and then, attestations and frameworks. When people talk about and look at cloud services specifically within AWS, FedRAMP tends to be that bar. From a reciprocity perspective, it's like if that service is FedRAMP authorized, I'm okay with that requirement. So that's one example.
So Noah, on that vein, because Greg mentioned it, StateRAMP and TexRAMP have reciprocity right now. What does that look like? What's that process if someone is already TexRAMP authorized or StateRAMP and vice versa?
Sure. So one of the things we have in place is a fast track process for providers that are FedRAMP authorized. And then, so that allows you to reuse your FedRAMP information, your controls, your documents, your CONMON, all of those things that you've done for your assessment, take them over to the StateRAMP side. We still do the assessment on behalf of the state. So while it is Reciprocity. It's not in its purest form. So we do still evaluate that documentation and make sure you're meeting the requirements. And then for TexRAMP, we have a reciprocity process with TexRAMP where if you are StateRAMP authorized, and like I mentioned earlier, the progressing snapshot program as well, where you are able to move into a provisional status with TexRAMP. You also have level 1 and level 2 certifications from StateRAMP. I think we have a weekly sync with their authorized product list. So as you come through the StateRAMP process, you will be able to achieve TexRAMP authorization as well, mainly due to our alignment with their standards, with their requirements for NIST. And so we try where we can to open up processes for providers to be able to take the work they've done and reuse it to meet additional requirements.
This is one more. So I would just say that it's some confusion and challenges to the environment. Because we often see, specifically in the universities, a customer will come to us for a cloud service provider. And their first comment is, I want to become a FedRAMP authorized. Why do you want to become FedRAMP authorized? Because I need taxes. And if I get StateRAMP, but then if I get FedRAMP, now I've opened up these new avenues, right? Obviously, FedRAMP is difficult to attain to some extent, right? You have to have these spots of the cost, the time. So when you look at all of that data, there's some misinformation on that reciprocity in that process. And from an agency to a cloud service provider, there's recommendations I think that you're trying to clear up with some of that conversation.
So it was like prompted you to make those comments. Is in the education that we're trying to do right now, there's other avenues and other approaches that may make more sense for service providers and others trying to work through this. So Ryan, I want to go back to you as the voice of the customer. Right? What are you seeing with your customers? We're working in kind of a multi-industry environment.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most common complaints I get, to be honest with you. A lot of the times, I think organizations are doing what they can to meet efficiency and reduce their audit fatigue. But in the grand scheme of things, they can only do so much. Really, when you think about it, a lot of organizations, what I've seen is they will make their own integrated control sets and create their own mapping back to the frameworks and standards because no one else is going to do it. It's not going to happen at the industry level, and they're going to take it upon themselves to do it. But at the end of the day, there's still a level of efficiency if they have to go through multiple different audits. And even though they use the same amount of evidence, effort, and controls, it's still multiple audits that they have to go through, and that adds a lot to their fatigue.
Yeah, so I feel like we've been building to something here. So, no, I'll come back to you. You and I have been working together, like I said, for over 12 months. You want to articulate some of the things that we're working on and kind of where we're going?
Sure. So one of the things that our main focus as part of that collaboration and reducing efforts on the provider side is working through a reciprocity process or a fast track process with HITRUST. So the ability to complete your HITRUST assessment and be able to take that information and reuse it for stateside with the StateRAMP program has really been our focus. So developing what that looks like, what that pilot program looks like, how do we work that program into ours? A big plus for the HITRUST community is it's not just organizationally defined. I can't make my own decisions on what controls are, what requirements are. I have an assessor that's doing that work, and then there's also oversight of the assessor. That's been a big missing piece, I think, for a lot of other frameworks when it comes to, you look at, not to pick on SOC 2, but SOC 2, the requirements where I get to kind of dictate what you're assessing. I get to dictate as the service provider what things need to be in place, what controls need to be in place. You have an assessor doing that work, and then there's no other real third party who's the oversight of the assessor. So that was one originally when we started talking with HITRUST, was they have this centralized function that's viewing what the assessor's doing and verifying if these things are in place and sampling the information, which is essentially what we do at StateRAMP at the PMO on behalf of the state and local government side. So was kind of the alignment was there when it came to process, when it came to quality of what we expect from the controls, from the assessments and the requirements. So working towards pilot, really excited to see providers coming through that process to try and help you reuse the work you've already done moving forward.
Yeah, so we're actively in trying to define what this pilot that we're going to launch looks like, what the criteria of the pilot consists of, and ultimately the whole goal is to get through the pilot, learn lessons, and then actually launch a program where you can fast track StateRAMP through HITRUST, which, based on my discussions with folks and your peers, seems to really resonate.
Being honest, I think it's going to be big. I honestly think that for a lot of organizations that go through HITRUST and now they're being required to go through StateRAMP, I mean, it's going to be that's going to be big for them to have to just go through one effort to get both, for sure.
I think part of and some of this stuff is still being defined, so I don't want to speak at turn, part of the attraction, especially when you look more broadly, is finding that agency sponsor. If you're trying to pursue StateRAMP particularly, that is the hurdle. The assessment is really where it's process. But it's more finding that agency sponsor. What we're doing, we may not have that burden to have to check that box because we're building it so it's more of a streamlined process. So, I think it's resonating. Think that there's a lot going on with this?
I agree. Yeah, for sure. That's one of the most common complaints I get is I have to go through 5 audits, even though I have the same control set. And when you realize how much time that takes, any one organization and their department, that can completely stress out a compliance department for almost the entire year, if you think about it, if they have different audits at different times. So that I think it's going to be a game changer when it comes to assessing once and reporting many.
So you talked on the sponsorship side, so that's a big piece. When StateRAMP was founded and we started building out this process, a lot of agency sponsors, especially at state and local government, their ability to sponsor someone, verify their information, check those things, their already limited bandwidth is not going to be donated. That time is not going to be donated to sponsoring someone. So that was a big part where StateRAMP came up with the approvals committee. It's I would liken it to FedRAMP JAB, where you have leadership from state and local government in the security space are able to make a determination. The difference being that you don't have to have a contract with the government. You don't have to do a use case or prioritization process. It is really, the idea was that we use these individuals to verify you've met the requirements of StateRAMP and you're able to move forward. So that was something we did early on in StateRAMP to try and alleviate some of that burden when it came to the agency side. And the sponsorship process was, really trying to help providers. That should not be a pain point you have to deal with. We're trying to assess you against the NIST requirements, not your ability to sell a contract to someone.
Yeah, so why don't we get into, probably you and I specifically, why don't we get into what the pilot is starting to, the vision of it, what it's forming into. So for those of you, obviously, that are familiar with HITRUST, you would go through the normal HITRUST process. When you would build your R2 assessment, so this pilot is based on the R2, you would actually bring in a regulatory factor that brings in the appropriate NIST baselines that are mapped to what StateRAMP is expected to see, go through the normal certification process, and then you would then come to the StateRAMP side, fill out the application, get the process started. Noah, this is where I would pass it on to you to kind of define what it would look like. Sure.
So a big piece that, the controls mapping side between HITRUST and StateRAMP / NIST, we've done. The big change for service providers coming through the program is really boundary diagram, data flow diagram, and then the continuous monitoring process we expect at StateRAMP. But ideally, what we want you to be able to do is take as much as you've done already through HITRUST, come into the program. You'll have some additional requirements that we're going to put in place with you and help you develop and get ready for. And then once you receive your authorization, you would then roll into continuous monitoring. So on a monthly basis, updated POAM document, plan of actions and milestones, your vulnerabilities, your findings, the things you're working through, the scan results from that work every month are provided to our PMO team. And it's really the delta between HITRUST and StateRAMP, that delta, trying to whittle that down as much as we can. And then we work on, someone's ringing. We work on that delta. How do we help you all meet those requirements and then roll into StateRAMP moving forward? A big part of this pilot work has been figuring out what those differences are and how we're going to tackle them, as well as HITRUST has done a really fantastic job on trying to do what they can to support us. From our process, from the review side, what we need to be able to see between Compliance Insights report and some of the other additional custom stuff that they're working on, being able to help support us as well as you in the program, so we ask you less questions when you come through, and ultimately alleviate some of the burden on your side. So I'm really excited to see how it turns out. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for providers, for HITRUST, for StateRAMP. I think that our ability to allow people to use assessments they've already completed and leverage those into a StateRAMP authorization, it's going to be a fantastic process for providers. So I welcome anyone to become part of that.
So Greg, I'm going to put you on the spot because this is kind of the first time you're hearing the details of the pilot and kind of what we're envisioning. Based on where you sit now and your experiences in the past, what are your initial reactions?
It's extremely helpful. It helps create finance. It helps some of the pad. Once you iron out, that conversation, accepting that R2 package, and then additional controls on top of that, from a document perspective. I think when that's ironed out, share it with service providers.
Yeah, and from the HITRUST side, what we're trying to do, a lot of the information that the StateRAMP team would be looking for you to provide is recaptured during the assessment process and ICSS. We're looking to develop some automated tools to repopulate a lot of that information. Now, that's not to say that it's going to be completely innocuous, because StateRAMP does look at things a little bit differently than HITRUST does, but we're trying to arm you as best as possible to ease through or expedite the process as quickly as possible. So Bill mentioned Compliance Insights report, which I'm not sure it's been mentioned in any session thus far, and probably hear it throughout the week. HITRUST, historically, when you get a HITRUST certified report, is all through the lens of HITRUST and controls and requirements the way we have them. We're developing a whole series of what we call Compliance Insights reports, which will basically take your testing results and put it through the lens of whatever authoritative source, or in this case, StateRAMP, what the StateRAMP team is expecting to see. So they don't have to decipher what HITRUST is asking. It's mapping to what you've done, the ones what you've done. So it'll be exactly what they expect to see from this perspective. So pretty excited about how those reports are taking shape, and we think that it will make this particular process. Okay, so there's probably some questions on, okay, how do I build my assessment? So I'll touch on that really quickly, and then we'll probably open it up for any questions in the audience. So that's your kids to get ready to ask them. So as I mentioned, it has to be an R2 assessment. Right? It's got to be version 11.1, and you have to select that grant monitoring regulatory. Choose the lending, probably will increase your assessment to a certain degree, but our thought process is it's still going to be a lot less work than if you went through HITRUST and then went through StateRAMP separately. So you feel there's some efficiency there. Public service announcement, you know, I touched on this, but I will stop my foot and hammer home. We are looking for pilot candidates, so if you're interested or if you're currently considering StateRAMP, TexRAMP, FedRAMP, find Bill or I after the session or something during the week. Love to talk to you about where you're at. We'll do some analysis to figure out what is your assessment look like today versus where it needs to be. Help arm you with information to go back internally if that's
on AWS finding.
Fine, right. All right, so any questions from the audience? One right over here. That would be first.
You guys can hear me from up there. All right, so the quick question is specifically talking about the states that have not adopted StateRAMP yet, especially when we're dealing with organizations that, let's be frank, they want to cover as many places as possible. In going down this track, I know that it is a moving process. What do we see for as the future of this, and we're looking at doing the high trust component as more states are adopted, especially when we're talking about the states adopting their own privacy programs and things like that? Are we needing to do reassessing part of those, like when we bring on another state like Illinois or where else? How is that going to be looking in the future?
So I think the question is around states and how we bring on those states into the program and they adopt StateRAMP, and how does that continue, I think, to grow and keep it standardized. So a big part of what we do with the states as they're onboarded, as they implement StateRAMP, is making sure that our controls and our requirements align with them. Most states require NIST framework controls. Ours just go a little bit further with the parameters of those controls. I think long term, where we intend to go, where we'd like to go, not just from the high trust side, but looking at I guess the elephant in the room we get asked about a lot is CGIS. So being able to incorporate not just additional states, but additional frameworks, additional requirements that a lot of states, I think, struggle with, because you have these requirements, this framework, these controls. There's no one really adding clarity or specifically stating what is required for each one of those control statements that are in the process. So we're trying to not just onboard additional states, we're also trying to bring in additional frameworks, high trust being one. But it's really, I think we're in this really, really cool place from the state side where states require some form of assessment today. And I've yet to see a state or local government who does require some form of assessment where StateRAMP does not either meet that or go above and beyond what they're currently requiring. So really it's just around procurement side, contracting, making sure that that language is in place and the state has what they need in order to be comfortable with moving into implementing StateRAMP across their government.
So I think to get a second part of the question, if someone gets authorized, right, I think you have 26 states. So they have a number of states that have adopted StateRAMP at this point. You get authorized now, and 30 more states are on board. You're not going to have to redo StateRAMP last cycle. You are automatically added to the available products for those states that are benefiting from that.
Then for the high trust component, if they go down the high trust route, that and you've done that process for the state grant fees, already have to reassess or add in those additional states as they're brought in.
So I can't promise that all states will have won't have additional requirements. What's really cool about the StateRAMP team and what we do on the PMO side specifically is we're really the focal point for you as the service provider and the state government. So say, for instance, you've completed your StateRAMP assessment, you have a state that comes in and says, yeah, I have these 1 or 2 additional controls that I want to have checked or implemented or required as part of the audit. Our job is to make sure that you're aware of that and make sure that you know that as part of the assessment, whether you need to go out to a third-party assessor and have those reassessed or work with us at the PMO team to check it. It varies. For the most part, the states we have seen come into the program, when we start going through the documentation, the requirements, boundary diagrams, the continuous monitoring side, they're less concerned about some additional control requirements when you start showing them the vulnerability scan information and the POAM tracking that we're doing on a monthly basis. They tend to not have what I would call ancillary requirements. They tend to adopt the program because I think having insight that level of insight is far more important than some additional unique requirements. There's always going to be those, but for the most part, we at StateRAMP, especially on the PMO side, we do what we can with the government to make sure that there's a good justification for that, because it's a lot of work on the service provider side to meet those requirements.
And just to push on the higher side of the equation, right now we're still defining what year 2, 3 like authorization from StateRAMP. Or more than likely you're going to still follow the same certification iteration that you're on. So for 2, you'll still do certification. But we're going to figure a lot of those things out, and ultimately that's what we're trying to do. There's another question back here.
Yes, Padilla with Kratos. We're a third-party assessment organization for FedRAMP, StateRAMP, and HITRUST. The Reciprocity, is it going to provide directional reciprocity?
We actually have not talked about that at this point. I mean, I can't say it's off the table, but because this is something very new and I think unique among organizations like ours, we're kind of taking it a piece at a time. So not to say that it's off the table, it just hasn't been focused on because we're trying to get this fast track program.
And I think a big part of it too is that, we at StateRAMP, we're focused on cloud solutions, which is pretty broad. With HITRUST being focused in the health side, there's so many additional requirements. I think if you were StateRAMP authorized and you were coming through the HITRUST program, there's going to be a lot of privacy and health concerns that you need to implement additionally. We haven't talked about bidirectional. The main focus is how do we take a service provider from the HITRUST side and bring them in. Like Ryan said, I wouldn't take it off the table, but it's not one we've really tried to tackle just yet.
So coming at this from the HITRUST perspective, coming through tackling HITRUST, R2, and then adding up, leveling up for the StateRAMP controls and all the evidence to really demonstrate that. It's a heavy lift. I think there are definitely organizations, including mine, that are looking at it and seeing it as a benefit across the nation. Nobody really wants to play whack-a-mole with individual state-level regulations. But are we getting healthcare organizations and hospitals, and I appreciate this is more HITRUST specific, but are we getting the kind of end customers on board to say, if you've gone through this heavy lift, we will stop asking you hundreds of questions and limit the questions to the material questions, because I think that would be a really compelling situation to say, right, we will go through this, we'll do the heavy lift. There is a really big carrot at the end of that process.
So from the StateRAMP side, I think a big piece of it is, everyone has their disparate requirements and how they're going to check those things and staff to check those things. We at the PMO side on StateRAMP, when we're working with providers, a big way we're able to keep them in alignment with it as far as requirements and convincing them that this is something that they should leverage is you have a centralized resource at the StateRAMP PMO. So if you're coming through HITRUST, you come to StateRAMP and you're doing business with, and I encourage providers to push back on the requirements. Should you be sharing all of your documentation in your ConMon that goes into a FOIable solicitation package? We at the PMO use a service provider push back, and I think if you had a client who was saying you need to meet these requirements or these aren't what we need to see this. If you tell them that yes, I'm HITRUST or I'm StateRAMP and this is where this documentation lives and you can request access to it, we then at the PMO have that conversation with your client and have that conversation of this is the documentation you'd be looking at. These are the control requirements. Here's how they've been trending over the last X amount of days. Here's the POAM documentation. And it really I think for anyone who is a potential client, that light bulb kind of happens where it's, oh my gosh, this is so much more than I would normally require, and it's meeting all these specific check boxes I have. It's really, I think, from the service provider community, pushing back against your clients and saying, yeah, I have this information, you have a questionnaire, but I want you to be pulled into this and see how these things are being done on our side. I don't think any client's going to say, yeah, more visibility is a problem for them. So I think push back and say, yes, I have this thing in place, I've completed this assessment, and it meets all of your requirements and then some. You need to request access, and you need to be able to see that information on your own versus me filling out another questionnaire that's going to get sent somewhere.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, actually. A lot of the issues that we have are really in the actually, no, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
So just wind it back. So around clients requiring StateRAMP or HITRUST or their own separate questionnaire.
So we see it all the time on our side of the house, right? Clients coming to us saying, I'm HITRUST certified. I've got ISO 27001. I still have to answer this 200 question questionnaire. And I agree that there's a big educational component to it. We have to, understand that there are clients, we can only push back so much. That's understandable. But there's other avenues too, like engaging with your third-party assessor, your HITRUST assessor organization, to have them be your service provider and help engage in those conversations. We do it all the time at 360 Advanced. We get, a lot of the times we'll get on calls with our client and our client's clients and help explain to them, what is, what about this questionnaire, or what about the HITRUST certification are you not seeing from this questionnaire, or, it's just an educational opportunity for them.
I think too, you're able to show not just, I've done an assessment and that was a year ago and I've submitted my report. A big selling point, especially where we come from on the StateRAMP side, is that you're going to have an entire team, and it's not going to cost you anything as the client. You're going to have an entire team at the StateRAMP PMO who's validating that information, who's checking it, and you're also going to have monthly continuous monitoring that's being submitted as well. So it's not a point in time assessment. It's every month you're going to have an update of how that system is trending from a vulnerability perspective. We're doing the legwork on validating those scans. We're checking to make sure that they're not hitting any of the vulnerability thresholds that we have established in our CONMON performance guidance that says you need to be, under this number in order to be considered called green. So I don't think a client would have a lot of room to rebuttal that requirement, just because we're going so far and above and beyond on the requirements and having that monthly information and that whole team to reach out to. It really is just an education piece. I think it's just explaining to them what this is, what the requirements are, and what you've done to get there. And I think if they're listening, and there's always going to be those that don't, but if they're listening, that's something that they'll be more than happy to view that information and roll into the program.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that, by design, you're implementing StateRAMP, if you're meeting those StateRAMP requirements, we'll often have clients come to us, for some informal advisory services, and we can always share with them and push back. And we can always have a conversation on your behalf with the StateRAMP team. Internally, externally, whatever that means, it's always about have open and clear communication, understand that 300, questionnaire is no longer needed, because I guarantee you that StateRAMP is answering all those questions. And as a team, we're happy from AWS perspective if that client is looking to procure your solution as it runs on AWS. We're happy to have that discussion with them.
Donna, when I stood up here this morning and I said ask the tough questions, I didn't mean to be. Yeah, it is the elephant in the room. Every session, people are bringing this up. Like, we had 2 vendor sessions or 2 HCPT council members yesterday, and that was the question. If I do HITRUST, you stop sending me your questionnaire. And it's a legitimate problem, right? And I'd love to sit here and tell you that this is going to solve that problem. It may to a certain degree, because sometimes you may get an entity that is in this shop, and now that you'd be able to translate what they're expecting to see through the state grant authorization, because it's also being done in good ways of this, so that may help in that case. But it really is going to take the community. It's going to take everybody in this room and the people outside of this room in the healthcare industry to say enough is enough. We need to collaborate and understand and build this level of trust. Because that's really what it boils down to. And I'm getting philosophical here and a little bit emotional, but it's something I talk about every single day. You know, people are holding on to these proprietary questionnaires and their internal processes because they're scared. They're afraid that something's going to happen if they are not touching it themselves. And it really, these two gentlemen touched on each one of their comments. A lot of the times it boils down to education, but we also have to understand and trust each other based on what we understand that the process consists of. It's probably more thorough, rigorous, and better from a due diligence perspective than their internal proprietary questionnaire process. So I think we just keep on banging on the walls and jumping on desks until it starts to change. And I feel really strongly that Health 3PT is going to help on that front. Again, we all need to be a part of the equation, and I'm officially off my soapbox.
We have one more question over here.
You're right. I was going to ask about the cadence of the assessment in year 2 and year 3, because that's going to be part of the discussion when a client is about to sign up for this pilot program. They're going to ask all these questions. But it looks like the details are still being ironed out, and it's going to be ironed out during the pilot project. So I'll ask a different question. From a quality assurance standpoint, right now you do an R2 assessment, it goes to HITRUST. HITRUST is the governing body that's going to give that stamp of approval and the certification. With this HITRUST/StateRAMP approach, how's that cadence going to play out? Is that going to be the same process? Is HITRUST being the final piece of approval, or it's going to be a split work, or just from a logistics standpoint, how's that going to play out?
So I'll start off, and if you have anything to add. So it's going to go through the normal HITRUST quality assurance process. So if you've ever heard me speak, I talk about the 6 layers of quality assurance in each and every assessment. It's still going to go through all of that. What happens on the StateRAMP side is they're not going to just carte blanche take it on the surface. They're still going to do a review and analysis. But what we've avoided is having to go through all the same testing again on the same step. So no, I don't. You want to articulate what you think right now?
So we don't, I would say, offload the review work to anyone, realistically. We at the PMO validate every single package that comes through. Even those that come through the FedRAMP fast track process, we are still checking all of the requirements that are in place. It's really about the service provider being able to reuse their audit and not pay for another assessment of controls that have already been assessed once. But we do a check of everything that comes through our program. So if you come through a HITRUST program, you come over to StateRAMP. Today, StateRAMP is an annual assessment, and then we have monthly continuous monitoring. Still working through that on the pilot side on how we're going to lay that in with HITRUST's cadence. But yeah, everything that comes through the program will be validated by the StateRAMP PMO. So any disparate changes, requirements, anything like that, we're going to be vetting every single one of those. And then onboarding you to those additional requirements that StateRAMP has.
I know we have one more question, but we're already 5 minutes over. If you want to meet us after.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. Okay. Sorry, don't want to keep you all from lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Every time I do it.